The air in Blackwood Creek hangs thick and wet in March. It's a humid cold that seeps into your bones, a souvenir of the dying winter clinging to the hollows between the rolling Pennsylvania hills. On the evening of March 10th, 2005, that cold carried a scream. Her name was Trina Evans, 25 years old. She worked the second shift at the packaging plant, the last big employer in a town that was slowly bleeding out. The walk home from the bus stop was only a half mile, a path she'd taken 1,000 times. A stretch of cracked pavement bordered by a dark skeletal patch of woods on one side and the quiet sleeping houses of her neighbors on the other. She never saw him coming. One moment there was the familiar crunch of her boots on gravel. The next, a hand clamped over her mouth, reeking of stale cigarettes and something else. Something metallic and sour. An arm like an iron band wrapped around her waist, dragging her off the path and into the trees. The ground was a mess of damp, decaying leaves that swallowed her sounds of struggle. He was strong, wiry strong. He pressed her against the rough bark of an oak, his breath hot and ragged against her ear. He didn't say much, just grunts, animal sounds. His face was covered by a dark cloth, but she could see the glint of his eyes in the faint moonlight filtering through the branches. They were empty, not angry, not lustful, just vacant. He was fumbling with the button of her jeans when the headlights swept across the woods. A pickup truck turning into a nearby driveway. The sudden flood of light startled him. A man's voice yelled out, "Hey, what's going on over there?" The attacker froze for a heartbeat, then he was gone. He melted back into the deeper darkness of the woods as if he were made of it. Trina slid down the tree, gasping, her body trembling uncontrollably. The man from the truck, a neighbor named Gus, rushed over. He helped her up, wrapped his own jacket around her shoulders. By the time the sheriff's deputies arrived, Trina was in shock, but she could give them something, not a face, but a feeling, a shape. He was male. Under 30, she thought, skinny, maybe 5'7", 5'8". His skin, what she could see of his hands, was dark, weathered. He wore cheap clothes, a thin short-sleeved shirt despite the biting cold. His voice was strange, a flat northern accent, not from around here, and one other thing. As he had grabbed her, his sleeve had ridden up his arm. On his wrist was a watch, a cheap digital one, a Timex, she thought, the kind with the black plastic band. Detective Frank Miller got the call at home. He'd lived in Blackwood Creek his whole life, seen it go from a bustling steel town to a graveyard of rusted factories. He knew the quiet dread that lived just beneath the surface of a place like this. An assault like this wasn't common, but it wasn't unheard of either. It was the kind of random, ugly violence that festered in places where hope had packed its bags and left. The investigation went nowhere fast. The description was a ghost. A slim young man with a northern accent and a cheap watch could be any one of 100 transient workers who drifted through the county looking for odd jobs. Frank and his team checked the records of local parolees, known sex offenders. Nothing matched. The woods yielded no footprints, no dropped weapon, nothing but damp leaves and fear. Days turned into a week. The town's fear subsided back into its usual low-grade anxiety. But Trina Evans couldn't forget. The memory of those empty eyes, that sour breath, was branded into her mind. She started seeing him everywhere, in the face of a stranger at the grocery store, in the silhouette of a man walking on the other side of the street. Then her fear started to focus. It settled on two men from her world. The first was a guy from her shift at the plant, Scott Duvall. He fit the general description. Dark complexion, about the right height, single. He had a kind of smarmy confidence, always trying to flirt with the women on the line, and his accent was definitely from somewhere up north. He gave her the creeps, but it was a familiar kind of creepiness, the kind you could brush off. The other man was different. He was a ghost even before the attack. A guy named Warren who rented a small, dilapidated room in a boarding house a few blocks from her. He was a drifter. No one knew where he came from. He had that same northern accent. He was reclusive, strange. He shuffled when he walked, his eyes always fixed on the ground. Trina had seen him once, sitting on the porch of the boarding house, and on his wrist she saw it, a black plastic-banded Timex watch. The sight sent a spike of ice through her veins. She called Detective Miller. Frank Miller decided to check them both out. Scott Duvall was easy. He had an alibi for the night of the attack, a poker game with 3 other guys from the plant. They all confirmed it. That left the ghost, the man named Warren. Frank and his deputy, a young, eager kid named Peterson, drove over to the boarding house. It was a sad, sagging structure that smelled of boiled cabbage and despair. Warren wasn't there. The landlord, a weary woman with tired eyes, said he kept to himself, paid his rent in cash, on time. That was all she knew. Frank asked to see his room. It was small, bare, a single mattress on the floor, a few changes of clothes folded neatly on a wooden crate. It was unnervingly clean, except for one thing. Under the mattress, Frank found a wallet. Inside was a driver's license, but the picture wasn't of Warren. It was Scott Duval, the man from the factory. And tucked in with the license was $1,300 in cash. This was no longer just about an assault. This was something else. They put out a bolo for Warren. He had no car, no known associates. He was a man who could simply vanish, but he didn't. 2 days later, a patrolman spotted him walking along the highway, miles out of town, as if he were trying to walk out of his own life. They brought him into the interrogation room at the county sheriff's office. The room was small, painted a sickly shade of beige, and it smelled of stale coffee and fear. The man who called himself Warren sat at the metal table, his hands cuffed in front of him. He wouldn't look at Frank. He just stared at the scarred surface of the table. He was gaunt, with sallow skin stretched tight over his cheekbones. His eyes were dull, lifeless. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out from the inside. Frank started easy. He asked about the wallet, about Scott Duval. Warren didn't answer. He just sat there, a statue of misery. Frank pushed a little harder. He mentioned the money, the theft. Finally, the man spoke. His voice was a low, gravelly monotone, completely devoid of emotion. "I took it," he said. "The wallet, the money, the watch." Frank's eyebrows shot up. The watch. He hadn't mentioned a watch. "What watch?" "The Timex," Warren said, his eyes still on the table. "It was his, Scott's. He was passed out drunk. I took it from his room 2 nights before the girl." A call to Scott Duval confirmed it. He'd been blackout drunk a few nights before the attack. Woke up the next morning. His wallet and his favorite watch were gone. He'd been too embarrassed to report it. With that, the case of the assault seemed to snap shut. Scott Duval, drunk and angry about being robbed, sees Trina, a woman from work who had rejected his advances. He attacks her wearing the very watch the real thief had stolen. It was messy, but it made a kind of sick sense. They brought Scott in. Faced with the evidence, the timeline, the watch, he crumbled. He confessed. He said he'd been watching Trina for weeks. He admitted he followed her that night, that he attacked her, that he ran when the truck's headlights hit him. The case was closed. Frank Miller felt the familiar grim satisfaction of putting a predator away. He told the deputy to process the thief, the man named Warren, for the burglary. It was a simple open and shut theft case. As Deputy Peterson was leading Warren out of the interrogation room, the hollowed-out man stopped. He turned his head slowly, his dead eyes finally meeting Frank's. For the first time, a flicker of something passed through them. It wasn't fear. It wasn't remorse. It was something else entirely, something cold and ancient. "That's not all," Warren said, his voice as flat as a dead man's heartbeat. "I did something else. I once killed someone." The air in the room went still. The casual chatter in the hallway outside seemed to fade away. Frank Miller felt a cold knot form in his stomach. This wasn't the end of a case. It was the beginning of a nightmare. The man's real name wasn't Warren. His ID, found in a shabby duffel bag in his room, said his name was Warren Schultz. Born in 1967, a name that meant nothing, a name that was about to become synonymous with a darkness so profound it would shake the foundations of justice itself. Warren Schultz came from nowhere, or more accurately, he came from a place so poor and forgotten it might as well have been nowhere. A dirt-poor farming family in upstate New York, one of so many children that he was less a son and more a stray mouth to feed. He was the runt of the litter, and his family never let him forget it. His father was a hard, bitter man who communicated mostly with his fists. His older brother, Wayne, was a carbon copy of the old man, but with a sharper, more cruel intelligence. Wayne was convinced Warren wasn't his father's son, a suspicion he whispered into the old man's ear like poison, a constant incitement to another beating. "He ain't one of us," Wayne would say, watching with a smirk as their father's rage boiled over. Warren learned to be invisible. He dropped out of school in the 2nd grade, unable to read or write beyond his own name. He spent his days wandering the woods and fields, a small, silent ghost haunting the edges of his own life. His only companions were the dead. He would spend hours in the old, overgrown family cemetery on the back 40, a place of crumbling, tilted headstones. He felt more at home there than he ever did in the cramped, loud house filled with a family that despised him. He thought about suicide sometimes, lying on the cold earth of a great-great-grandfather's grave, wondering if it would be warmer down below. The first crack in his soul appeared when he was 14. He was hiding in the bushes near the cemetery, his usual spot, when he saw them, a teenage couple from a neighboring farm, tangled together in the tall grass, their movements urgent and mysterious. Warren watched, his breath caught in his throat. He didn't understand what he was seeing, not fully, but it lit a strange fire in him, a curdled, cold curiosity. A few days later, he saw a neighbor's little girl, no older than 7, playing by herself near that same spot. The fire in him flickered. He grabbed her. He tried to do to her what he had seen the couple do. He didn't know why. It was an impulse, a wire short-circuiting in his brain. The girl's screams brought her father running. They sent him to a juvenile detention center. He stayed there until he was 18. He never spoke about what he did. He never showed any remorse. He just did his time, silent and watchful. When he got out, he was a man, but he was still a hollow shell. His parents, desperate to normalize him, to pin him down to a respectable life, arranged a marriage, a kind of trade. They had a daughter, and a neighboring family had a son. They swapped. Warren was married to a woman named Cao Hong, a quiet, frightened girl of 20. They had a son, but marriage and fatherhood were just clothes Warren wore. Underneath, the hollow space remained, and it was starting to get hungry. He began to confess, sitting in that beige interrogation room under the flat, buzzing fluorescent lights. The darkness inside Warren Schultz started to spill out. It wasn't a flood. It was a slow, thick, black ooze. Between 1993 and 1995, he said, he had raped 6 women in the desolate, forgotten corners of upstate New York and northern Pennsylvania. His voice never changed its dead, flat tone. He spoke of unspeakable acts as if he were reciting a grocery list. Frank Miller and the other deputies listened, their faces grim masks of disbelief and horror. They had arrested a petty thief. They had stumbled into the lair of a monster. 2 of the rapes, Warren added, almost as an afterthought, had ended in murder. He had squeezed the life out of them because it was easier than listening to them scream. One of those murders had a name that had been a ghost in Blackwood Creek for 10 long years. He said he had killed a woman named Connie Bishop. The name hit Frank Miller like a physical blow. Connie Bishop. August 5th, 1994. A day that had burned itself into the town's collective memory. Connie was 28, a worker at the old steel mill, married to her high school sweetheart. She disappeared on a Friday afternoon after her shift. She'd biked to work that day, a hot, sticky August day. She never made it home. Her husband, frantic, organized a search party. For a week, half the town combed the woods and fields surrounding the mill. They found her in a cornfield, a week after she vanished. The corn was high and dense, a perfect place to hide a secret. Her body was decomposed, ravaged by the heat and the elements. Her clothes were torn. Her bicycle lay on its side a few yards away, half swallowed by the weeds. The coroner's report was blunt. She had been raped. Cause of death was mechanical asphyxiation. Strangulation. There was male DNA present, but in 1994, DNA technology was still in its infancy, especially for a small county department. It was a dead end. The pressure to solve the case was immense. Connie was one of their own. The investigation had been a frantic, desperate scramble. Suspicion fell briefly on a neighbor who had a history of being a peeping Tom, but he had a rock-solid alibi. He'd been in the hospital for gallbladder surgery. Then, in September, they got a break. Or so they thought. They arrested a kid named Neil Pasternak. He was 20 years old, a skinny, awkward kid who worked at the same steel mill as Connie. He was a nobody, quiet, kept to himself. But someone had reported seeing his bicycle near the cornfield around the time Connie disappeared. It wasn't much, but it was all they had. They brought Neil in for questioning. For 7 days, they interrogated him. 7 days in a small, windowless room. The official record of those 7 days was sparse. What is known is that on the 7th day, Neil Pasternak confessed. He broke down, weeping. He said he had seen Connie riding her bike home. He said he couldn't control himself. He'd followed her, dragged her into the cornfield. He said she fought back and he lost his head. He squeezed her throat until she went limp. It was a confession. It closed the case. The district attorney, a man eager to make a name for himself, rushed it to trial. In March of 1995, Neil Pasternak was found guilty and sentenced to death. His family, his parents, and his sister were devastated. They swore he was innocent. They said he was a gentle soul who wouldn't hurt a fly. They said the police had broken him, fed him details, forced a confession out of a scared, simple kid. But no one listened. On April 27, 1995, at the age of 21, Neil Pasternak was executed by lethal injection. He was a ghost, a closed case, a sad footnote in the town's history. And now, 10 years later, the man who was supposed to be a petty thief was sitting in Frank Miller's interrogation room, calmly taking credit for the crime that had sent Neil Pasternak to his grave. "I saw her from the construction site," Warren Schultz said, his voice a low drone. The site was a new warehouse being built about 200 yards from the cornfield. He'd been working there as a day laborer. She rode by every day on her bike, pretty, a blue dress. The detail was right. Connie had been wearing a blue floral print dress that day. I waited for her, hid in the corn. It was easy. Frank felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. He leaned forward. "What else, Warren? Tell me everything you remember." Warren Schultz closed his eyes for a moment as if accessing a file in a dusty cabinet in his mind. "She had keys," he said, "in her hand. When I grabbed her, she dropped them. A single key. For the bike lock. I remember the sound it made when it fell in the dirt. After I was done, I picked it up. I didn't want anyone to find it. I threw it as far as I could deep into the corn." Frank Miller's blood ran cold. The key. The single bicycle key. It was a detail that had been in the original 1994 case file. It was a detail the search party had never found. It was a detail that had never been released to the public, never mentioned in the papers or at the trial. It was a secret known only to the killer and to the police. A case with one victim and 2 murderers. A man executed and another man confessing 10 years too late. The story broke, and it hit the state like a lightning strike. The headlines were stark, brutal. Who killed Connie Bishop, the ghost or the monster? Another one read, 10 years after execution, real killer emerges. Was Neil Pasternak an innocent man? The public outcry was a roar. The tidy, tragic story of Neil Pasternak, the monster next door, was suddenly ripped open, exposing something far more horrifying beneath. The possibility that the system itself was the monster. The state police in Harrisburg were forced to get involved. A special task force was assembled, a fresh set of eyes to look at a case that had suddenly become a political nightmare. They took Warren Schultz and began the painstaking work of verifying his other confessions, the 5 other rapes, the other murder. They found cold case files that matched his stories with terrifying accuracy. Dates, locations, victim descriptions. Warren Schultz was exactly what he claimed to be. A prolific, remorseless serial predator. But when it came time for the district attorney's office to file the official charges, the murder of Connie Bishop was conspicuously absent. They charged him with 5 rapes and 1 murder. The ghost of Neil Pasternak, it seemed, was too inconvenient to resurrect. The official position of the Hebei County DA was that Neil Pasternak's conviction was sound. He was the killer. Warren Schultz, they claimed, was a liar, an opportunist trying to muddy the waters or perhaps angle for some kind of deal by confessing to a high-profile crime he didn't commit. This was the point where the case spiraled out of the realm of simple crime and punishment and into a bizarre, Kafkaesque twilight zone. Warren Schultz, the monster, did something no one expected. He appealed. Through his court-appointed public defender, he insisted that he be charged with the murder of Connie Bishop. His argument was as perverse as it was logical. He claimed that his confession to her murder was a significant act of cooperation, a demonstration of his willingness to clear the slate. Under the law, such a confession, bringing closure to a major case, could be considered a mitigating factor, a reason to spare him the death penalty and give him life without parole instead. So began one of the strangest legal battles in American history. The defendant, a self-confessed serial killer and rapist, was actively trying to prove his own guilt in a murder, and the prosecution, the very people whose job it was to convict murderers, were fighting with all their might to prove him innocent of that specific crime. The courtroom was a theater of the absurd. The prosecutor, a slick, ambitious man named Robert Davies, stood before the judge and argued that Warren Schultz's confession was unreliable and self-serving. He painted Schultz as a cunning manipulator. This man, Davies declared, his voice ringing with false righteousness, is trying to hijack the tragic memory of Connie Bishop and the legally settled case of her killer, Neil Pasternak, for his own selfish gain. He sees a high-profile case and latches onto it like a parasite. Schultz's public defender, a tired, overworked man named Ben Carter, found himself in the surreal position of arguing for his own client's monstrosity. "Your Honor," Carter said, his voice heavy with the irony of it all, "my client has provided details that only the killer could know. The bicycle key, the location. He is not seeking fame. He is seeking to have the full scope of his actions recognized by this court, as is his right." The most damning piece of evidence, the key, became a major point of contention. The prosecution argued that perhaps the detail had been leaked over the years, that Schultz could have heard it from another inmate, a guard, anyone. They had no evidence of this, but they floated the possibility, casting doubt wherever they could. They were not seeking truth. They were engaged in institutional damage control. Admitting that Warren Schultz killed Connie Bishop meant admitting that they, the state, had killed an innocent man. It was a truth too terrible for them to acknowledge. The Hebei County High Court sided with the prosecution. They ruled that since Neil Pasternak had already been tried, convicted, and executed, he was, in the eyes of the law, the confirmed culprit. Warren Schultz's confession was therefore legally meaningless. They went even further, stating that his insistence on this false confession demonstrated not sincerity, but a profound lack of remorse for his other confirmed crimes. They upheld the original charges and subsequently the death sentence. The system had spoken. It had looked at a truth so obvious it screamed, and it had chosen to be deaf, dumb, and blind. It had sacrificed the ghost of one innocent man to protect its own reputation. But the story wasn't over. It had captured the nation's attention, and it had given a voice to the one person who had never stopped screaming for justice, Neil Pasternak's mother, Carol. For 10 years, Carol Pasternak had lived in a quiet hell. The shame of having a son branded a rapist and murderer had isolated her. Her husband had died of a heart attack 2 years after the execution, a death she always called a broken heart, but she never for 1 second believed her son was guilty. She knew the gentle, awkward boy she had raised. Now, the killer himself was shouting her son's innocence from the rooftops. Carol, a small bird-like woman with fierce, determined eyes, became an unlikely public figure. She gave interviews, appeared on news shows, her voice trembling but resolute. "They killed my boy," she would say, clutching a worn photograph of Neil, "and now they won't even listen to the man who did it. What kind of justice is that? They don't care about the truth. They only care about covering up their mistake." Her fight caught the attention of innocence projects and civil rights lawyers. The public outcry grew louder. The case of Warren Schultz and the ghost of Neil Pasternak became a symbol of a broken system. The pressure cooker of public opinion, media scrutiny, and legal challenges finally reached a boiling point. In 2014, spurred by a national review of capital punishment cases, the Supreme Court of the United States agreed to review the Pasternak case. It was an extraordinary step. They didn't just review it. They ordered a full re-examination, assigning it to the High Court of the neighboring state of Ohio to ensure impartiality. A new team of investigators, prosecutors, and judges would look at the 1994 case with fresh eyes. For 2 years, The Ohio court meticulously deconstructed the case that had sent Neil Pasternak to his death. They re-interviewed the original witnesses. They analyzed the forensic evidence, or rather, the lack of it. They scrutinized the 7-day interrogation of Neil Pasternak, and what they found was horrifying. The original verdict, they determined, was built on a foundation of sand. There was no objective evidence linking Neil to the crime. The DNA found on Connie Bishop's body did not match his. The witness who claimed to see his bicycle nearby later admitted under questioning that he wasn't sure of the day or the time. The confession itself was a mess of contradictions and inaccuracies. It became clear that Neil, a scared, low IQ kid, had been relentlessly pressured by seasoned detectives who likely fed him the details they needed to hear. Key documents were missing from the original case file, including the full, unedited logs of his interrogation and testimonies from witnesses who had provided alibis for him. In May of 2016, the Ohio High Court issued its findings. The original verdict against Neil Pasternak, they wrote, lacked objective evidence. The charges of rape and murder were loose and groundless. On November 30th, 2016, the final official word came down from the nation's highest court. The Supreme Court of the United States of America officially declared Neil Pasternak innocent. They listed 8 distinct and catastrophic failures in the original investigation and trial. After 21 years, the ghost was finally given a name again, not a killer's name. The name of a victim. Warren Schultz was still on death row. His appeals regarding the Connie Bishop murder continued to fail. Even with Neil Pasternak officially exonerated, the courts refused to formally name Schultz as Connie's killer. To do so would be to connect the dots, to officially sanction the narrative that the state of Pennsylvania had executed an innocent man, so they let it hang in a legal limbo. The case of Connie Bishop was now officially a murder with no perpetrator. Schultz's confession was denied as a basis for leniency. His crimes, the ones they were willing to acknowledge, were more than enough to justify his fate. On February 2nd, 2021, a needle was inserted into Warren Schultz's arm. The hollow man was finally filled with a poison that stopped his heart. He died as he had lived, without emotion, without a flicker of anything resembling a human soul. For Carol Pasternak, the fight was not quite over. She sued the state of Pennsylvania for the wrongful death of her son. She asked for nearly $14 million, a number that represented a lifetime of stolen years and unbearable pain. The court awarded her $2.7 million. It was less than she asked for, but it was the highest amount ever awarded in America for a wrongful execution. It was a fortune stained with blood. But one question remained, screamed by Carol Pasternak and echoed by the public. Who was responsible? Who were the detectives that coerced the confession? Who was the prosecutor who ignored the lack of evidence and rushed an innocent man to his death? The state of Pennsylvania refused to release their names. They were protected by a wall of institutional silence. No one was held accountable. No one lost their job. No one faced charges. The system that had killed Neil Pasternak had investigated itself and found itself blameless. It was the final, most chilling injustice of all. A few years later, the director of public safety for Hay County, at the time of the original investigation, a man who had long since retired, was investigated and convicted on unrelated corruption charges. It was the closest anyone ever came to a reckoning. To understand the full, sickening depth of the story, you have to go back to the source. Back to Warren Schultz himself. His own brother, Wayne, the one who had tormented him as a child, was interviewed after his arrest. "He was always stupid," Wayne said, his face a mask of contempt. "An idiot. He ruined our family's name. When they execute him, I'll make sure he's not buried here. He's not one of us." Detective Frank Miller, the man who had first heard the confession, never forgot the look in Schultz's eyes. "I handled his case for years," Frank would later recall, his voice low. "I never saw him smile. I never saw him cry. He was just empty. A void in the shape of a man." In one of his psychiatric evaluations, Schultz was asked about the first murder he committed. Did he feel remorse? Guilt? He looked at the doctor with his dead eyes. "It felt comfortable," he said. "All the bad feelings I had inside, they just went away. It was a release." The true nature of his sickness was buried in the details of his crimes, details the public never heard. He had a bizarre, specific sexual pathology. He collected women's clothing, not just lingerie, but everyday shirts, underwear, bras. He took them from his victims, from clotheslines, from unlocked cars. His wife, the quiet woman he had a son with, confirmed it. She told investigators that he would sometimes wear the clothes himself, in secret. She also told them of his most disturbing habit. He had a preference, a powerful fetish for the smell of women's menstrual blood. His attacks were often spontaneous, triggered by an uncontrollable urge. The appearance of his victims didn't matter. Whether they were menstruating didn't matter. The urge, once it took hold, was all-consuming. He was a creature of pure, undiluted impulse. And so the story ends, but it doesn't conclude. It leaves a stain that can't be washed away. Neil Pasternak, an innocent man, was exonerated, but he is still dead. His family received a sum of money that could never replace a son, a brother, a life. Warren Schultz, a monster, was executed, but not for the crime that exposed the system's greatest sin. And the murder of Connie Bishop, the crime that started it all, is now an open case. A case with a confession from a dead man that the law refuses to accept. A case with no killer. It's a story that reminds us that sometimes the most terrifying monsters aren't the ones who hide in the cornfields. They're the ones who wear suits and robes, who uphold a version of justice that is more concerned with its own infallibility than with the truth. Mistakes in the system are inevitable. Humans are flawed. But the way those mistakes are rectified, or in this case buried, is where the real horror lies. The system created a ghost, then tried to pretend it didn't exist, even when the real killer stood up and pointed right at it. And in the quiet, decaying corners of places like Blackwood Creek, you have to wonder how many other ghosts are still waiting for their names to be spoken. How many other truths are buried in a shallow grave, covered over by the neat, tidy lies of a justice that is blind in all the wrong ways. The chill you feel isn't just from the memory of Warren Schultz. It's the cold, hard realization that the nightmare he unleashed didn't end with his death. It's still out there, embedded in the very system we trust to protect us.